I came home and found the HOA draining my $10 million reservoir behind a gate they had cut open. When I came home after 3 months away, 2 industrial pumps were already draining my $10 million reservoir through a ranch gate someone had cut open. The HOA president told me she had every legal right to do it. I knew she didn't. What I didn't know was why she needed my water badly enough to risk crossing that line. Then my attorney found 6 missing pages, a handwritten note, and 1 county filing with Linda Carver's signature on it. That was when I realized this was never really about the reservoir. Stay with me, because the line on one old property map would eventually put an entire development and Cedar Hollow's own water access on the line. And if you enjoy stories where patience, property rights, and good records matter more than shouting, subscribe and stick around. This one starts with a cut gate, but it ends somewhere Linda never expected. Daniel Mercer saw the water line before he saw the pumps. He had been back on Mercer Ridge Ranch less than 5 minutes, his pickup still coated with Nevada dust from 3 months on a municipal water project. When the reservoir came into view beyond the cottonwoods, something was wrong. The shoreline sat far below the stone marker near the north bank, not a foot, not 2, close to 12. Daniel slowed the truck until the tires barely moved over the gravel. For a few seconds, he thought maybe the angle was fooling him. Then he saw fresh mud exposed beneath the old waterline. A band of pale clay wrapped around the reservoir like a scar. Then came the sound. Diesel engines. Low, steady, mechanical. Daniel turned toward the Western Service Road and saw 2 industrial pumping units parked behind his ranch fence. Thick black hoses ran from the reservoir, crossed his pasture, and disappeared downhill toward Cedar Hollow Estates. He stopped the truck. The gate chain hung loose from one post. It had been cut clean through. Daniel sat behind the wheel with one hand resting on the gear shift. At 51, he had spent enough years around construction sites, county offices, engineering disputes, and water agreements to know that anger was most expensive when acted on too early, so he did not drive toward the men. He took out his phone. First photograph, the cut chain. Second, the tire tracks through his pasture. Third, the nearest pump. Fourth, the discharge meter. Fifth, the hoses running east. Then he climbed out. The air smelled of wet clay, diesel, and disturbed grass. 3 contractors were working near the lower intake structure. One man in an orange vest noticed Daniel and raised a hand. "Can I help you?" Daniel kept walking until he was 10 yards away. "You can start by telling me who authorized this." The man looked toward the second pump, Cedar Hollow HOA. Daniel said nothing. The man seemed uncomfortable with the silence. "We were contracted to lower the reservoir." "How far?" "Another 6 feet, I think." Daniel looked past him. One of the shoreline control boxes had been opened. A monitoring cable that should have been secured beneath a steel cover was hanging loose. Fresh wrench marks showed on the bolts around the intake housing. Daniel felt something cold settle beneath his anger. "Who from Cedar Hollow?" The contractor checked a clipboard. "Linda Carver." That name Daniel knew. Everybody along the county road knew Linda Carver. She had been president of Cedar Hollow Estates for 4 years and had developed a reputation for treating association rules like county law. Daniel had never paid much attention. Cedar Hollow sat below his eastern ridge. His ranch predated the subdivision by decades, and he had no reason to involve himself in neighborhood arguments about fences, paint colors, or landscaping. Until now. "What did she tell you this was?" The contractor hesitated. "A community water feature." Daniel looked at him. "A what?" Her words, not mine. She said it was uncontrolled and creating drainage and mosquito issues along the western edge of the development. Said the HOA had authority to manage it. Daniel turned slowly toward the reservoir. The phrase would have been almost funny if 2 pumps had not been pulling water out of a $10 million private asset while he stood there. Mercer Ridge Reservoir was not ornamental. It had a reinforced earthen dam engineered intake controls, monitored storage levels, and a county-approved emergency connection that served Cedar Hollow during wildfire conditions. Daniel and his father had spent years improving the system. Daniel had spent millions more modernizing it after taking full ownership of the ranch. Cedar Hollow did use the water, under very specific conditions. That was not the same thing as owning it. Daniel took another photograph. The contractor watched him. "Look, sir, if there's a property dispute, you'll have to take it up with the HOA. We were given paperwork. I'd like a copy. I can't release the contract. I didn't ask for your contract." Daniel pointed toward the pump. "I want the written authorization that says you can enter my property and alter that reservoir." The man glanced toward his crew. "I'll have to call my office. Do that." Daniel stepped away and dialed the county sheriff's non-emergency line. Deputy Colin Reeves arrived 27 minutes later in a white county SUV. Daniel knew him by sight, though they had never spoken more than a few words. Reeves was in his early 40s, quiet, deliberate, with the habit of looking at a scene before asking anyone to explain it. He started with the gate. "Your chain? Yes. You cut it?" "No. Anyone have permission to?" Reeves photographed the links, then followed the tire tracks toward the pumps. The contractor produced an email printout with Linda Carver's name at the bottom and a Cedar Hollow HOA letterhead attached to the work order. Reeves read it. Then he looked at Daniel. "This says they have association authority over water features affecting common area drainage." Daniel nodded toward the reservoir. "They don't." Reeves looked back at the document. "You part of the HOA? No. Property inside their recorded boundary? No. Any easement? There's an emergency use agreement." The deputy waited. Daniel added, "Use, not control." That changed Reeves's expression. He walked to the edge of the reservoir and studied the exposed intake line. "What exactly do they use it for?" "Fire reserve. Emergency pumping if the county activates the system." Reeves looked downhill. Cedar Hollow's roofs were visible through the trees. "So they're draining the reservoir that backs up their own fire system?" Daniel looked at the running hoses. Apparently, Reeves turned toward the contractor. "I'm documenting a possible trespass and property damage complaint. Until ownership and access authority are verified, I strongly suggest nobody makes this situation worse." The contractor immediately shut down one pump. The second went quiet less than a minute later. The sudden absence of engine noise was almost startling. Water continued draining through the hoses for several seconds, then slowed. Silence settled over the pasture. Daniel walked to the bank. 12 feet of exposed clay stretched below him. Fresh boot prints marked the mud near the control structure. The reservoir surface, usually broad enough to catch the whole western sky, looked shrunken and wrong. He crouched beside the opened monitoring box. The level sensor had been disconnected. That was not landscaping. That was interference with infrastructure. His phone buzzed. "Unknown number," Daniel answered. A woman's voice came through, composed and clipped. "Mr. Mercer? This is Linda Carver with Cedar Hollow Estates. I understand you've interrupted authorized HOA work." Daniel looked at Deputy Reeves, then back at the damaged shoreline. "Authorized by whom?" "The association." "This is my land." There was a short pause, then Linda said, "You may own the parcel, Mr. Mercer, but the HOA has recorded rights over that reservoir." Daniel's eyes moved toward the black hoses lying across his pasture. "You're sure about that?" "Completely." Daniel let the silence sit. Then he said, "I'll see you tomorrow morning." He ended the call. Reeves had heard enough to raise one eyebrow. "She sounds confident." Daniel looked toward Cedar Hollow. "That's what bothers me, because Linda Carver was wrong. The reservoir belonged to Daniel, the dam belonged to Daniel, the control system belonged to Daniel, and the old agreement Cedar Hollow depended on had never given the HOA authority to drain so much as a gallon without permission." Which left Daniel with one question. If Linda did not own the reservoir, why was she so certain she had the right to drain it? At 9 the next morning, Daniel walked into the Cedar Hollow clubhouse carrying nothing but a legal pad and his phone. Linda Carver was waiting. She had arranged 3 documents across the conference table: HOA bylaws, printed resident complaints, and a photocopied agreement with several paragraphs highlighted in yellow. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I hope we can resolve this without involving the sheriff again." Daniel sat across from her. "I hope we can resolve it with the right document." Linda pushed the photocopy toward him. "This is the recorded agreement governing Cedar Hollow's rights to the reservoir." Daniel recognized the heading immediately: Emergency Water Access and Storage Agreement. His father had signed the original 15 years earlier when Cedar Hollow was being developed below the ridge. Daniel turned the first page, then the second, then the third. There was nothing else. He looked at the staple in the upper corner. "Where are pages 4 through 9? Linda barely hesitated. "Technical attachments. They're part of the recorded agreement. They concern operational details." Daniel looked at her. "Then why aren't they here?" Linda folded her hands. "Because they aren't relevant to the association's authority." Daniel returned his attention to page 2. A highlighted paragraph granted Cedar Hollow access to reservoir water for emergency fire suppression and certain approved common area purposes. Linda had underlined the words access, maintenance, and water infrastructure. "You're interpreting this as ownership management authority," she corrected. "The HOA has a duty to protect the community. Your reservoir had become an uncontrolled water feature affecting the western boundary. It was 12 feet lower yesterday than when I left Colorado. The drawdown was intentional. You ordered another 6 feet to permit shoreline remediation. On my property, on infrastructure subject to association rights." Her voice never rose. That bothered Daniel more than shouting would have. "Did you contact county utilities before starting?" "No." "The state water engineer?" "No." "The fire district?" There was no reason. "Did you obtain an environmental review?" This was maintenance. Daniel tapped the incomplete agreement. "Did an attorney review all 9 pages?" Linda's expression tightened. "The HOA understands its governing rights. That wasn't my question." A pause. Then she said, "Our counsel is aware of the project." Daniel wrote those words on his legal pad. Linda noticed. "You're making this more adversarial than necessary. Yesterday, somebody cut a chain on my gate. The contractor needed access. Did I give it? The agreement provides access. Does it provide access to drain the reservoir?" Linda leaned back. "You've been gone for 3 months, Mr. Mercer. Residents have dealt with mosquitoes, exposed vegetation, and concerns about stagnant water. The association couldn't wait indefinitely for an absentee landowner." There it was. Not law, opportunity. Daniel studied her for a moment. "How much water have you removed?" "The contractor has those figures. You authorized the work without knowing the volume?" "I authorized a target elevation, which is," Linda named it. Daniel knew the number instantly. Another 6 feet would bring the reservoir dangerously close to the elevation of Cedar Hollow's emergency intake. He closed the agreement. "Stop the drainage." "No." It was the first word Linda delivered with any real force. "The board approved the project. Your interference yesterday caused additional contractor costs, and Cedar Hollow will reserve the right to recover them." Daniel almost smiled. Instead, he stood. "You should read the other 6 pages before those pumps start again." Linda's eyes hardened. "I have read the agreement, then read it again." Daniel left the 3-page copy on the table by noon. Rachel Bennett was sitting across from him in her small law office in Montrose, with a laptop open between them. Rachel had handled Mercer Ridge property matters for 8 years. She did not guess about recorded instruments. She pulled them. The county archive returned the document at 12:17, 9 pages. Daniel watched Rachel scroll. Pages 1 through 3 matched Linda's copy. Page 4 defined the emergency intake. Page 5 established maintenance responsibilities. Page 6 limited access to designated service corridors. Rachel slowed on page 7. "There." Daniel leaned closer. Paragraph 8. The language was plain enough that neither of them spoke while reading it. Cedar Hollow's right to withdraw water was a limited emergency use license. It granted no ownership interest in the reservoir, dam, shoreline, control structures, or underlying land. Then came the enforcement provision. Any unauthorized alteration of reservoir elevation, intake equipment, monitoring systems, dam structures, or shoreline controls by Cedar Hollow or its agents would trigger immediate suspension of the association's withdrawal rights pending inspection and recertification by the appropriate authorities. Daniel read it twice. He pictured the exposed mud, the disconnected sensor, the opened control box, the pumps. Rachel moved to page 8. This gets worse. The agreement required Cedar Hollow to preserve minimum storage capacity for wildfire response whenever the emergency connection remained active. Daniel looked at her. They were draining toward their own intake elevation. I know, my father insisted on that clause, and Linda's contractors may have violated almost every restriction attached to it. Daniel sat back. For the first time since returning home, his anger gave way to something colder. Structure, a problem with edges, a problem that could be documented. Rachel saved the complete agreement, then opened a new file. Tomorrow morning I'm notifying county utilities, the fire district, and the state water engineer. I also want the contractor's work order, the HOA board authorization, and every communication related to this project. Daniel nodded. Rachel looked again at paragraph 8. Daniel, he waited. She didn't just trespass. Rachel turned the laptop toward him. She may have shut off her own HOA's legal access to the reservoir. By 8 the next morning, that possibility was no longer theoretical. County utilities sent 2 inspectors to Mercer Ridge Ranch with representatives from the fire district and the state water engineer's office. Daniel met them at the cut gate, then walked them down to the reservoir without saying more than necessary. The evidence spoke for itself. The intake housing had been opened. A monitoring sensor had been disconnected. The reservoir had been lowered far beyond its normal seasonal range. Fresh wrench marks showed where one of the shoreline controls had been moved, and the black hoses from Linda's contractor were still lying across Daniel's pasture like something abandoned in a hurry. One county inspector crouched beside the control box and looked up. Who authorized work on this equipment? Daniel handed him the contractor's paperwork. Cedar Hollow HOA. The inspector read Linda Carver's name, then looked toward the subdivision below the ridge. They understand this feeds their emergency system, that's what I've been asking. By late morning, the county issued a temporary suspension order. Cedar Hollow's connection to Mercer Ridge Reservoir would remain closed until the altered system was inspected, repaired, and formally recertified. Daniel did not touch a valve. He did not order the neighborhood's water shut off. He did not have that power. Cedar Hollow's homes still received ordinary drinking water from the municipal system, but the reservoir connection served other things the subdivision had quietly depended on for years: common area irrigation, the private fire hydrant reserve, several landscaping zones, supplemental storage required for wildfire readiness. By afternoon, bright county notices were taped to the clubhouse doors. Temporary suspension of emergency reservoir connection. Linda called Daniel before sunset. He let it ring twice, then answered. You had no right to cut off Cedar Hollow's water. Daniel stood beside the reservoir, looking at the exposed clay below the old shoreline. I didn't. The county acted because of your complaint. The county acted because your contractors altered a regulated system. You are punishing 60 families over a disagreement. Daniel's jaw tightened. Household water is still on. That is not the point. It is exactly the point. He could hear voices behind Linda. A meeting maybe, doors opening and closing. You ordered people onto my land, Daniel continued. They cut my gate, lowered my reservoir, disconnected monitoring equipment, and changed an intake control. The county inspected what they did. The county made the decision. Linda's voice cooled. You know perfectly well residents will blame you. Then tell them the truth. She hung up. The consequences became visible within 2 days. At Cedar Hollow's stone entrance, the decorative grass strips stopped receiving supplemental irrigation. Sprinkler heads clicked, but pushed nothing into the air. The small ornamental pond beside the clubhouse dropped several inches because its refill line had been tied into the common area system. More serious was the fire notice. The district posted temporary restrictions on Cedar Hollow's private hydrant network until emergency storage certification could be restored. Residents started calling the HOA office. Then they started showing up. Megan Foster was one of the first to contact Daniel directly. She met him near the lower ranch fence, carrying a folder under one arm. I want you to know, not everyone supported this. Daniel remembered her name from Linda's board roster. You voted no? Yes. Why? Because no one could answer the ownership question. She glanced toward the reservoir. I asked where the recorded boundary was. Linda said the easement made ownership irrelevant. Daniel said nothing. Megan lowered her voice. She's telling people you retaliated because the HOA asked you to maintain your property. Daniel looked toward Cedar Hollow's roofs. That's not what happened. I know. She handed him the folder. Inside were copies of 2 meeting notices and handwritten notes from a neighborhood discussion held before the drainage started. One line had been circled twice. Property owner currently out of state. Project window favorable. Daniel read it. Megan watched his face. She wanted it done before you got back. That evening, Daniel stood alone on the berm. The reservoir looked smaller than it had in years. The exposed shoreline had already begun drying hard around the edges. A heron picked its way through the shallows where deep water should have been. Daniel remembered his father standing in nearly the same place years earlier while the first dam improvements were being finished. His father had not cared whether Cedar Hollow residents ever thanked him for the emergency connection. He had cared that, during a bad fire season, the water would be there. Daniel felt no satisfaction knowing Cedar Hollow had lost access, only anger at the reason. His phone buzzed. Rachel, I've sent preservation notices to the HOA and their council, she said. Board minutes, emails, contractor communications, every version of the water agreement. How long? They have deadlines now. Daniel looked down at the damaged intake. Rachel continued. And Daniel, Linda is publicly calling this an act of retaliation. I figured. That may help us. How? Because if she keeps explaining herself before we see the records, she may lock herself into a story the records don't support. Daniel looked toward the darkening subdivision below. For the first time, the conflict was moving away from the reservoir and into something Linda could not control with a board vote. Paper, emails, minutes, signatures. Rachel's voice sharpened. I want to know exactly what she knew before those pumps crossed your gate. Daniel watched the last light catch the low reservoir surface. So do I. And somewhere inside Cedar Hollow's records was the answer. Rachel found the first part 3 days later. She called Daniel to her office just after lunch and had 3 printed emails laid across the conference table when he arrived. The first was from Eric Dalton, Cedar Hollow's treasurer, subject line, Reservoir Agreement, paragraph 8. Daniel read it. Eric had written to Linda 2 weeks before the contractors entered Mercer Ridge Ranch. The message was short. He said paragraph 8 appeared to prohibit Cedar Hollow from altering reservoir elevation or control equipment without Daniel's authorization. He recommended that the board delay the project until independent counsel reviewed the entire agreement. Daniel looked up. She was warned. Rachel slid the second page toward him. Linda's reply had been sent 17 minutes later. Legal review will slow this down unnecessarily. Once the work is completed, Mercer will have no practical reason to reverse it. Daniel read the sentence twice. There was no misunderstanding in it, no confusion over landscaping, no suggestion that Linda believed Daniel had approved the work. She knew someone on her own board had raised a legal problem. She proceeded anyway. Rachel tapped the third printout. She also had the complete agreement. Attached to Linda's reply was a scanned copy, 9 pages, all of them. Daniel leaned back in his chair. So the missing 6 pages at the clubhouse weren't missing. No, she chose not to show them to me. That's how it looks. Rachel's voice stayed measured, but Daniel knew her well enough to hear the shift beneath it. This was no longer a weak HOA interpretation. It was becoming evidence of intent. The next piece came from Megan Foster. She met Rachel and Daniel that evening at the ranch house with a spiral notebook she had used during 3 board meetings. Megan had voted against the drainage plan from the beginning. Her notes showed that Linda repeatedly pushed to complete the project while Daniel was still working out of state. At one meeting, Eric had asked why the board could not wait 2 weeks and contact Daniel directly. Megan had written Linda's answer word for word. If we give him time to object, nothing gets done. Daniel stared at the line. That sounds like her. Megan nodded. There was more. She turned the page. Linda had argued that Cedar Hollow had to establish active management of the reservoir before the end of the quarter. Daniel looked at Rachel. Active management? Rachel's expression changed. That phrase matters. Why? Because it sounds less like landscaping and more like somebody trying to establish a record of control. Megan looked between them. Control for what? Rachel did not answer yet. We need the invoices and planning files first. The strongest piece arrived the following morning. Cedar Hollow's administrative assistant produced the board's working folder under Rachel's preservation demand. Inside was Linda's own printed copy of the 9-page agreement. Paragraph 8 had been highlighted. So had the restriction on altering reservoir levels. Clipped to the front was the yellow note in Linda's handwriting. Rachel photographed it before touching anything else. 4 words stood at the top. Do not circulate complete agreement. Below that, in smaller handwriting, wait until project is finished. Daniel stood beside Rachel in silence. For nearly a week, Linda had insisted publicly that the dispute was about maintenance authority and an absentee ranch owner who refused to cooperate. Now the paper in front of them showed something else. She had known the agreement contained restrictions. She had been warned by her treasurer. She had withheld the complete document, and she had pushed the work forward before Daniel could intervene. Rachel finally spoke. This changes the case. Daniel looked at the note. How much? It makes a good faith mistake harder to argue. She turned the folder over and checked the remaining documents, and it gives us a reason to look harder at why she needed the project finished so quickly. Megan folded her arms. You think the reservoir wasn't really the issue? Rachel pulled one more document from the file, a contractor invoice. The description was different from the landscaping language Linda had used at the clubhouse. Phase 1. Reservoir level reduction and access preparation. Daniel read the last 2 words, access preparation. Rachel nodded. Preparation for what? No one answered. Outside the office window, a delivery truck moved slowly along the county road toward Cedar Hollow. Daniel looked down again at Linda's handwritten instruction. By then, the drainage no longer looked like an arrogant mistake. It looked planned, and he still did not know what Linda Carver had been trying so hard to gain control of before he came home. Rachel found the answer in Cedar Hollow's planning records. 2 days after the contractor invoice surfaced, she called Daniel and asked him to meet her at the county planning office. By the time he arrived, she had already pulled a development file thick enough to explain Linda's urgency. The project was called Cedar Hollow East, 28 new homes, 72 acres. Daniel recognized the land immediately. It bordered the subdivision on the east side, a dry rolling tract owned by an investment group that had been trying to sell for years. Rachel opened the county application. The developer needs additional fire water capacity before the county will approve this. Daniel scanned the engineering summary. Cedar Hollow's existing municipal supply was enough for household use, but the expansion pushed the subdivision beyond the fire storage threshold required for final approval. He turned another page. There it was, proposed supplemental emergency source Mercer Ridge Reservoir. Daniel went still. They used my reservoir in the application. Rachel nodded. Not just used it. She pointed lower on the page. A statement certified that Cedar Hollow possessed operational control over the reservoir for emergency storage purposes. The certification had been submitted by the HOA. Daniel looked at the signature block. Linda Carver. He read it again. She signed this 6 weeks before the pumps crossed your gate. Daniel set the page down carefully. Now the timing made sense. The missing pages, the rush while he was out of state, the phrase active management, the contractor invoice marked access preparation. This had never been about mosquitoes. Rachel pulled another document from the file. Here's the developer correspondence. The name at the top was Mark Ellison, representative for the group behind Cedar Hollow East. In one email, Mark asked whether the HOA could confirm permanent access to Mercer Ridge Reservoir if the county required a larger intake. Linda replied, Cedar Hollow has established rights over the reservoir and intends to exercise management authority as needed. Daniel stared at the sentence. Established rights. She was turning a limited emergency license into something much broader. Daniel looked through the window toward the courthouse parking lot. Years earlier, before the current expansion plan existed, a consultant had approached him about increasing Cedar Hollow's reservoir withdrawals. Daniel had rejected it. The reason had been simple. More homes meant more demand. More demand meant a larger intake, additional pumping equipment, and a permanent service road across Mercer Ridge Ranch. It also meant someone else gaining physical access to infrastructure Daniel was legally responsible for maintaining. He had said no, not angrily, just clearly. Rachel closed the file halfway. Linda knew that. She should have. The rejection went through the developer's prior consultant, so she couldn't get an agreement from and the county wouldn't approve the expansion without more fire water capacity. Daniel looked down at Linda's certification, so she decided to prove control by exercising it. Rachel nodded. Drain the reservoir, move equipment, establish access. Then tell the county Cedar Hollow already manages the system. For the first time since coming home, Daniel felt anger push past the cold discipline he had been holding on to. Not because Linda wanted development, not even because she wanted the water. Because she had tried to create a legal fact by physically crossing his boundary and daring him to undo it afterward. Rachel slid one final item across the table, a contractor sketch. It showed the existing emergency intake at Mercer Ridge Reservoir. Beside it, in dashed lines, was a proposed larger intake and a service route running across Daniel's pasture. No easement, no signed agreement, no permission, just a line drawn across his land, as if the land had already said yes. Daniel studied it. My father built that first connection to help protect the families below the ridge. Rachel said nothing. He never gave them the ranch. Daniel folded the sketch once and placed it back on the table. Rachel tapped Linda's signed county certification. If she represented private infrastructure as HOA controlled in an official development filing, this is bigger than the drainage. How much bigger? Potentially enough to freeze the entire project. Daniel looked at her. Rachel continued. The county relied on that certification when they accepted the expansion application. If the representation was false, they'll want to know immediately. Outside, wind moved dust across the courthouse steps. Daniel looked again at Linda's signature. One name, one claim, one private reservoir she had never owned. And suddenly, her effort to control his water threatened far more than her position as HOA president. Cedar Hollow called an emergency meeting 2 nights later. By 7 o'clock, every chair in the clubhouse was taken. Residents stood along the walls, filled the back hallway, and crowded near the glass doors leading to the parking lot. Daniel did not sit with the board. He stood near the rear beside Rachel. Linda Carver entered last. She wore the same composed expression she had used across the conference table when she told Daniel the HOA had authority over his reservoir. Only this time, nobody smiled back. Eric Dalton opened the meeting. His hands shook slightly as he unfolded a printed email. "I sent this to Linda before the work began." Linda turned toward him. "Eric, this is privileged board communication." "No," Rachel said quietly from the back. "It isn't." Heads turned. Eric kept reading. He read paragraph 8, then his warning that the HOA might be prohibited from altering reservoir levels, then Linda's reply. "Legal review will slow this down unnecessarily." The room changed. A woman in the second row said, "You were warned?" Linda lifted one hand. The board was dealing with an urgent infrastructure issue. Megan Foster stood. "No, we were dealing with a project you wanted finished before Daniel got home." She held up her notebook. "I wrote down what you said." Linda's jaw tightened. "Megan, handwritten notes are not official minutes. They don't need to be official to show what I heard." Megan read the line aloud. "If we give him time to object, nothing gets done." A murmur moved through that room. Daniel stayed silent. That silence mattered. Linda had spent days telling residents he was angry, vindictive, and trying to punish Cedar Hollow. But he had not called the meeting. He had not demanded her removal. He had not touched anyone's household water. He had brought documents, and now the HOA's own people were reading them. The board's newly retained attorney, a gray-haired man named Stephen Cole, rose from the end of the table. "I need residents to understand the association's current exposure." The room settled. Cole spoke carefully. "The county has suspended Cedar Hollow's emergency reservoir connection because work was performed on private infrastructure without verified authority. If the conduct is determined to have been intentional and outside the association's lawful scope, portions of the resulting liability may not be covered by insurance." Someone near the doors said, "What does that mean for us? It could mean special assessments." The room erupted. "How much? Are we talking thousands? Can they put liens on our homes?" Cole raised both hands. "No numbers have been determined. But yes, the association could face substantial costs." Linda leaned toward the microphone. This is exactly what Daniel Mercer wanted. Daniel finally moved, not toward Linda, toward the center aisle. "No." The room went quiet. Daniel looked at the residents, not at her. "I wanted my gate left intact. I wanted my reservoir left alone. I wanted the agreement your HOA relies on to be read before anyone brought pumps onto my land." Linda cut in. "You triggered the county suspension. The county triggered the suspension after inspecting what your contractors altered. You could restore access tomorrow, not without inspection and recertification." Cole spoke before Linda could answer. "Mr. Mercer is correct. That landed harder than anything Daniel could have said." Linda looked at her own attorney. Cole continued. "Cedar Hollow cannot safely or legally resume use until the county clears the system." A man near the front stood. "So you risked our fire certification, our landscaping system, and potentially our money for a project you were warned not to do." Linda's composure cracked for the first time. "You do not understand the broader development interests involved." The room went still. Rachel looked at Daniel. Linda seemed to realize what she had said. Too late, Eric pushed back his chair. "I move that Linda Carver's authority as HOA president be suspended pending independent legal and financial review," Megan seconded. The vote passed 3-1. Linda did not move. Then she gathered her folder. "This board is panicking because one ranch owner knows how to manipulate regulatory agencies." No one defended her. She walked out through the glass doors alone. They closed behind her with a soft mechanical click. Rachel's phone vibrated almost immediately. She looked at the screen, then at Daniel. "What?" She held the phone toward him. An email from the County Planning Department, Cedar Hollow East, administrative hold. Daniel read the first paragraph. The 28-home expansion application had been frozen pending review of the HOA's claimed operational control over Mercer Ridge Reservoir. Rachel scrolled lower. Attached was the certification that triggered the review. Linda Carver's signature sat at that bottom. Daniel looked through the glass doors. Linda was still crossing the parking lot. She had lost the board in less than an hour. Now the development she had been trying to secure was frozen too. And the next question was no longer whether Linda had overreached. It was whether her own signature had just destroyed the project she crossed Daniel's gate to save. Rachel had the county filing printed by 8 the next morning. Daniel met her at the records office, where a retired utilities supervisor named Tom Alvarez was already waiting beside a wide table covered with plats and easement maps. Tom had helped commission Cedar Hollow's original emergency connection 15 years earlier. He wore reading glasses low on his nose and studied Linda's certification for less than a minute before shaking his head. She could not have gotten this from our agreement. Daniel pointed to the phrase operational control. That's what she certified. I can read it. Tom pulled the original recorded plat closer. This line here is Cedar Hollow. His finger traced the subdivision's western boundary. Then he moved across several hundred feet of white space toward the reservoir. This is Mercer Ridge Ranch. The dam, control structure, intake housing, and shoreline all sat well outside Cedar Hollow's property line. Tom tapped the emergency connection. We gave them one thing: the ability to withdraw water under defined emergency conditions, not management authority. No, not shoreline access, only for specifically authorized inspection and emergency servicing. Development rights? Tom actually laughed once. Rachel placed Linda's signed filing beside the map. So if the county accepted this certification as proof Cedar Hollow controlled the reservoir, they accepted a false premise. Tom's expression hardened. The entire reason we drafted the agreement this way was to prevent exactly this. Daniel's father wanted Cedar Hollow protected from wildfire. He did not want a future board treating the ranch like common property. Daniel looked at the old plat. His father's signature was still visible near the lower corner. For a moment, that mattered more than Linda's. Then Deputy Colin Reeves arrived with the supplemental trespass report. He had finished documenting the contractor's route onto Mercer Ridge. The service gate was marked private property, he said. We found the old warning sign in the weeds beside the post. Daniel frowned. Old sign? Looks like somebody pulled it down before the equipment came through. Reeves opened a photo on his tablet. The metal sign was bent, but readable. Mercer Ridge Ranch authorized access only. Rachel looked at him. Any indication who removed it? Not enough to say. But the contractor foreman confirmed they entered through that gate after being told the HOA had full authority, and the chain? Cut by the crew. On whose instruction? Reeves turned a page. According to the foreman, Linda told them access had been cleared. Another piece clicked into place. Linda could no longer argue that the contractors wandered accidentally across an uncertain boundary. There had been a gate, a chain, a sign, and a direct instruction. By noon, Rachel had assembled the evidence into one sequence. The recorded deed established Daniel's ownership. The plat established the boundary. The 9-page agreement limited Cedar Hollow to emergency use. Tom Alvarez confirmed the original purpose. Eric's email proved Linda had been warned. Megan's notes showed she pushed the work while Daniel was away. Deputy Reeves documented forced access, and Linda's own county filing claimed authority. None of those documents gave her. Rachel laid the pages in a row across her conference table. This is the first time the whole thing makes sense. Daniel stood at the window because she needed the county to believe Cedar Hollow controlled the reservoir. Yes. So she tried to make the paper true after she had already signed it. Rachel nodded. By creating a physical record of control. Daniel looked back at Linda's signature. Drain it. Alter the equipment. Cross the gate. Then argue they had always managed it. That would be my theory. His phone buzzed. A message from Megan. Cedar Hollow residents had received formal notice that the county's administrative hold would remain in place until ownership and fire storage rights were resolved. The developer representative, Mark Ellison, had canceled a scheduled presentation to investors. The expansion was starting to unravel. Rachel gathered the maps. This is going to court. Daniel looked at the plat again. The black boundary line was thin, almost ordinary, but it ended hundreds of feet before the reservoir. Linda had spent months pretending that line did not matter. Now it was becoming the most important line in the case. Rachel tapped the county certification with one finger. If the judge accepts this map, she didn't just lose the reservoir. Daniel looked at her. Rachel finished quietly. She may have killed the development she was trying to save. By the end of that week, Daniel had enough leverage to end Cedar Hollow's reservoir access permanently. Rachel told him so in plain terms. The emergency use license was violated. The county has already suspended it. Given what Linda authorized, we can ask the court to terminate the agreement altogether. Daniel looked through her office window toward the western hills. And then, Cedar Hollow would need another source for emergency storage. That means 60 families lose the system my father helped build. Rachel watched him. Yes, Daniel did not answer right away. His father had signed the original agreement after a wildfire burned across 2 nearby ridges and forced residents to evacuate before Cedar Hollow was even fully developed. He had never liked the subdivision. He had liked the idea of homes sitting below dry grass with no reliable backup water, even less. Daniel folded his arms. I want Linda stopped. That I understand. I don't want families punished for living under her board. Rachel leaned back. So you want restoration instead of termination? Under new terms, the proposal Daniel gave Cedar Hollow 2 days later was strict. The HOA would pay for all reservoir repairs. Independent engineers would inspect the intake and controls. Cedar Hollow would sign a written acknowledgement that Mercer Ridge Reservoir, its dam, shoreline, pumps, access road, and control structures belonged entirely to Daniel. Emergency access would be limited to county-declared fire conditions and scheduled inspections. No HOA contractor could enter the ranch without written authorization, and the reservoir could not be used for any subdivision expansion, development application, or increased withdrawal without a separate negotiated agreement. Megan Foster read the proposal twice. This still gives us emergency water? If the county recertifies the system, and you're willing to keep that in place? Yes. She looked almost embarrassed. After what happened, Daniel glanced toward the lowered reservoir. You didn't cut my gate, neither did the 60 families below it. That distinction mattered to him. The new board accepted the proposal in principle within 24 hours. Linda did not. Her attorneys sent Rachel a letter arguing that Cedar Hollow possessed broader historic rights, and that Daniel's proposed conditions amounted to an unlawful restriction on association access. Rachel read the letter at Daniel's kitchen table. She still thinks the old agreement gives them control. Daniel took a sip of coffee. Or she needs to keep saying it does, because if she admits otherwise, the development filing collapses. He nodded. Rachel turned another page. They're asking the court for a declaration that Cedar Hollow's rights include reservoir management. Daniel almost laughed. After all this, they need that ruling, and if they don't get it, the county hold stays. Mark Ellison's project loses its claimed fire storage source, and Linda's signed certification becomes very difficult to explain. Daniel looked toward the ranch road. A temporary steel chain now hung across the gate where the old one had been cut. He had replaced the sign too. Private property, authorized access only. The next afternoon, Megan drove up from Cedar Hollow. She brought a copy of the board vote supporting Daniel's restoration proposal. People are angry, she said. At me, at Linda, at themselves, at the board. Daniel said nothing. Megan continued. Some residents want us to sue her separately. That's between you and your attorney. You really don't want the emergency agreement terminated? No. She studied him. Why? Daniel looked toward the reservoir, because water should solve the problem it was meant to solve, not create another one. Megan nodded slowly, for the first time since the pumps appeared behind his gate. Daniel felt the conflict narrow. The HOA was no longer the enemy. Linda's claim was, that made the path ahead cleaner. At the courthouse, Rachel filed Daniel's response and counterclaim. She asked for declaratory judgment on ownership, trespass damages, restoration costs, and a ruling defining Cedar Hollow's rights exactly as the recorded agreement described them. Nothing more, nothing less. When she called Daniel that evening, her voice was calm. They set the hearing date. How soon? 3 weeks. Daniel looked across the dark reservoir. The waterline was still low, the exposed bank still showed where the pumps had been. But now the argument had moved somewhere Linda could not control with a vote, a memo, or a cut chain, into court. And by refusing to punish the neighborhood, Daniel had taken away the last story Linda could tell about him being the aggressor. The hearing began on a Tuesday morning before Judge Rebecca Lawson. Rachel did not bury the court under every email, invoice, photograph, and meeting note they had collected. She chose 4 things: the plat, the 9-page agreement, Eric Dalton's warning email, and Linda Carver's signed county certification. Daniel understood why. If those 4 documents told the story clearly, everything else became confirmation. Rachel started with the map. Tom Alvarez took the witness stand and identified the recorded plat he had worked with when Cedar Hollow's emergency connection was created 15 years earlier. Rachel enlarged it on a courtroom monitor. A black line marked the subdivision boundary. Mercer Ridge Reservoir sat west of it. Far west. Tom placed a ruler against the scale. The reservoir control structure is approximately 640 feet outside Cedar Hollow's recorded boundary. Rachel pointed to the dam. OA property, no. The intake controls, no. The shoreline, no. The service road used by the contractors, Mercer Ridge Ranch. Linda's attorney stood for cross-examination. Mr. Alvarez, Cedar Hollow nevertheless has rights related to the reservoir, emergency use rights, so rights exist. Yes, meaning the boundary line does not end all HOA authority. Tom looked at him. It ends ownership. The courtroom went quiet. Rachel moved next to the agreement, 9 pages, not Linda's 3-page version. Judge Lawson followed along as Rachel read the language granting Cedar Hollow a limited emergency use license. Then paragraph 8, no alteration of reservoir elevation, no interference with intake equipment, no modification of monitoring systems. Unauthorized interference triggered suspension pending inspection and recertification. Rachel stopped. Did the agreement grant Cedar Hollow operational control? Tom answered, no. Management authority, no. Development rights. Linda sat rigidly at the defense table. The 3rd document was Eric's email. He testified that he had read paragraph 8 before the drainage project began and warned Linda in writing. Rachel handed him the printed exchange. Is this your email? Yes. Please read your warning, Eric did. Then Rachel asked him to read Linda's response. He hesitated. Judge Lawson looked over her glasses. Mr. Dalton? Eric cleared his throat. Legal review will slow this down unnecessarily. Once the work is completed, Mercer will have no practical reason to reverse it. No one moved. Rachel let the silence hold. Then she placed the county development certification on the evidence stand. Linda's signature appeared at the bottom. The document stated that Cedar Hollow possessed operational control of Mercer Ridge Reservoir for fire storage purposes related to Cedar Hollow East. Rachel looked toward the bench. That claim was made 6 weeks before contractors crossed Mr. Mercer's gate. Linda's attorney rose. The association believed its historic use created sufficient control for purposes of the application. Judge Lawson looked at him. "Show me." The attorney paused. "Your Honor, the clause." She tapped the 9-page agreement. "Show me the language granting operational control." He turned pages. Once, then again. The courtroom was so quiet Daniel could hear paper sliding against the defense table. The attorney finally said, "The agreement must be read in the broader context of long-standing use." Judge Lawson's expression did not change. "I asked for the clause." Another pause. "There is no clause using those exact words. Any words granting management authority?" "No, Your Honor." "Any provision allowing unilateral alteration of reservoir levels?" "No." "Any provision allowing development use?" Judge Lawson closed the agreement. That sound was small. It still felt final. Linda's defense shifted after that. Her attorney argued mistake, ambiguous interpretation, historic practice, good faith reliance. But every argument ran into the same 4 documents. The boundary stopped at Daniel's fence. The agreement limited the HOA, Eric warned Linda. Linda signed a certification claiming more authority than the agreement gave her. Rachel's closing was brief. "This case is not about whether Cedar Hollow needed water. Mr. Mercer has already offered to preserve legitimate emergency access. It is about whether permission to use another person's property for one defined purpose can be converted into ownership by assertion, repetition, and physical intrusion." Daniel looked at Linda. For the first time since this began, she was not explaining anything. She was listening. Judge Lawson announced that she would issue findings after reviewing the damages record and the county development filings. Until then, Cedar Hollow's emergency license would remain suspended. The expansion hold would remain in place. Outside the courtroom, Mark Ellison stood near the stone steps, speaking quietly into his phone. He ended the call when Daniel passed. "The investors are pulling back," Mark said. Daniel stopped. "Because of me?" Mark shook his head. "Because the project was built around water rights we apparently never had." Daniel continued toward his truck. Behind him, the courthouse doors closed. The evidence had established where Cedar Hollow's authority ended. But one question remained. What would Judge Lawson do now that Linda's signature had tied the illegal drainage directly to the development she had been trying to save? The answer came 11 days later. Judge Lawson issued a written ruling that ran 43 pages. Rachel called Daniel before breakfast. "You won." Daniel stood in his kitchen with the phone against his ear and looked through the window toward the reservoir. "All of it?" "Ownership, boundary, trespass, the emergency use agreement, the development claim." She paused. "And Linda, I tell you that morning." Daniel was back at the courthouse. Judge Lawson entered a declaratory order stating that Mercer Ridge Reservoir belonged entirely to Daniel and that Cedar Hollow held no ownership, management, or development authority over the reservoir, dam, shoreline, access road, or control structures. The HOA's rights were exactly what the agreement said they were. Limited emergency use. Nothing more. The court also found that the drainage operation constituted intentional interference with private infrastructure and that Linda had continued despite written warning from her own treasurer. Restoration and related damages were substantial. Cedar Hollow was ordered to fund the reservoir repairs, engineering inspections, damaged controls, and legal costs allowed by the court. Linda faced separate personal liability for conduct Judge Lawson described as deliberate action outside any reasonable interpretation of HOA authority. The exact number mattered, but not as much as the next paragraph. Cedar Hollow East could not rely on Mercer Ridge Reservoir for its fire storage requirement without a new written agreement from Daniel. The expansion application collapsed almost immediately. Mark Ellison withdrew it 3 days later. The 28 homes were never approved. Linda had crossed Daniel's gate to create the appearance of control. Instead, she had produced the evidence that proved she had none. Cedar Hollow elected a new board before the month ended. Megan Foster became president after insisting twice that she did not want the job. Eric Dalton stayed on as treasurer long enough to help separate the association's legitimate obligations from the damage created under Linda. Their first formal action was to accept Daniel's restoration terms. The new agreement was shorter than the old one. No vague language, no implied authority. Cedar Hollow could draw water only during county-declared emergencies and approved system tests. Any access to Mercer Ridge required notice and written authorization. No expansion use, no shoreline alterations, no management claim. Daniel signed it because 60 families still lived below dry Colorado grass. He had never wanted them unprotected. He only wanted the boundary respected. Linda appealed parts of the ruling. She lost. Months later, she sold her house in Cedar Hollow and left the neighborhood. Daniel did not watch her go. By then, he had work to do. Repairing the reservoir took most of the following season. The damaged shoreline controls were replaced. The disconnected sensor was upgraded. The intake housing was rebuilt behind a heavier steel enclosure. The cut wooden gate was replaced with a reinforced ranch gate carrying a new sign. Mercer Ridge Ranch, private property, emergency access, by agreement only. Snowmelt began filling the reservoir in late spring. At first, the rise was barely noticeable. Then the old waterline disappeared beneath clear water. Native grass returned along the berm. The exposed clay softened and vanished. One morning, Daniel saw 2 ducks settle near the eastern bank. A week later, the county fire department arrived for the first official emergency intake test under the new agreement. Megan stood beside Daniel while a tanker connected below the ridge. A county inspector watched the pressure gauge. The needle climbed, held steady, then stopped exactly where it should. System certified, the inspector said. Megan exhaled. Feels like a long road to get back where we started. Daniel looked across the reservoir. We didn't get back where we started. She glanced at him. He nodded toward the new gate, the repaired controls, and the signed agreement inside the inspector's clipboard. Now everybody knows what belongs to whom. The tanker disconnected. The line went quiet. Cedar Hollow had its emergency water back. Daniel had his reservoir back, and the development that had depended on pretending one was the other was gone. Later that evening, Daniel walked the top of the dam alone. The reservoir caught that last light and turned copper along the western edge. He stopped near the old stone marker that had first shown him how much water was missing when he came home months earlier. Now the water sat just below it, almost full. He thought about Linda's certainty, the cut chain, the pumps, the missing 6 pages. Her note telling the board not to circulate the agreement. Her signature on a map claiming control over land she did not own. None of it had been answered with threats. Daniel had answered with the deed, the boundary, the agreement, the emails, the county record. That was enough. Down in Cedar Hollow, sprinklers came on over the common lawn for the first time since the repairs. Farther beyond them, the 72-acre development tract remained empty. Dry grass moved across it in the evening wind. Daniel closed the steel gate behind him. Justice, he had learned, was not making the neighborhood thirsty. It was making sure borrowed permission could never again be mistaken for ownership. Behind him, the reservoir held its water, and this time, the line held too.
Daniel's experience leaves behind a lesson worth remembering. Standing your ground doesn't always mean raising your voice. Sometimes it means knowing what belongs to you, keeping the right records, asking the right questions, and refusing to let someone else's confidence become a substitute for the truth. Daniel had every reason to be angry, but he left the deeds, the agreement, the county records, and the law speak where anger could not. And maybe the most important choice come after the fight and nearly over. Daniel could have tried to end Cedar Hollow emergency access for good. Instead, he remembered why his father had allowed that water connection in the first place. The families below the ridge still deserve protection from fire. Holding Linda accountable did not require punishing everyone who happened to live under the same HOA. That is the quiet kind of trends, protect the boundary, reserve what matter, and leave things more clearly understood that you found them. If you had been in Daniel's bush, would you have kept set a hollow emergency water agreements, common ones for yes or zero for no? And tell us why. I genuinely like to hear how you would have handled it. And if story about ranch owners, property rights, HOA dispute, and ordinary people standing firm with patience and good sense are your kind of story, surprise and stay with us. There are more stories from beyond the fence line still to come.